Imagine finding an abandoned ship, just, floating out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Completely adrift.
Right. There's no crew. The navigation lights are still burning. The radio it's tuned to a distress channel. And sitting right there, right on the slanted saltwater slick deck, is an open doctor's bag.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And inside it, a scalpel, a stethoscope, and 4 freshly blood-stained bandages.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario.
It really is. I mean, it sounds exactly like the cold open to a horror movie. But in November of 1955, this actually happened. I want you to really picture it. You're out there hundreds of miles from the nearest speck of land. It is pitch black, like the kind of darkness that feels physically heavy.
The kind that presses right against your eyes.
Exactly, because the ocean at night, it isn't just a body of water, it's a void. And sitting dead in the center of that void is the MV Joyita. So today, we're doing a deep dive into the source material surrounding what a lot of people call the Mary Celeste of the South Pacific. We are pulling from historical maritime accounts, formal inquiry transcripts, and chronological records to try and reconstruct the horrifying final hours of this ship.
And I think we need to establish the ground rules for this investigation right off the bat, right?
Definitely.
We are not dealing with a ghost story here. We are not indulging in supernatural fiction or maritime folklore. What happened on the Joyita is a documented historical tragedy. It is a real-life horror story.
Absolutely.
Because when you look closely at the evidence, you realize this was the result of a terrifying, almost inevitable cascade of human error, blinding hubris, and silent mechanical failure. The goal today is to investigate the central, haunting question of this entire mystery.
Which is why?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why did 25 people seemingly choose to step off a virtually unsinkable ship directly into the freezing, storm-tossed void of the Pacific?
Right. And to answer that, I want to start by looking at the ship itself. Because if we're going to understand how 25 people just vanished without a single trace, we have to understand what they were sailing on.
Yeah, the vessel is a character in its own right.
It really is. And the Joyita, it wasn't some rusty utilitarian barge built for hauling cargo. The source material notes she was originally known as a little jewel.
Well, that's actually a literal translation. She was built in 1931 in Los Angeles by the Wilmington Boat Works.
Okay.
And originally, she was commissioned as a 69-foot luxury yacht for a Hollywood movie director, a guy named Roland West. He named her Joyita, which is Spanish for little jewel, after his wife, the actress Jewel Carmen.
Oh, wow. So this thing had glamour.
Totally. This vessel began its life steeped in 1930s Hollywood glamour, taking pleasure cruises down to Mexico and up to San Francisco.
But the sources also make a point to really emphasize her construction. I mean, this wasn't a fragile little pleasure craft. She was built with 2-inch thick cedar on oak frames. Now, I'm no shipbuilder, but that sounds incredibly heavy-duty for a yacht.
Oh, it's massively overbuilt for a standard pleasure yacht. Cedar is, it's highly resistant to rot, and oak provides incredible structural rigidity.
Right, oak is super hard.
Exactly. When you combine 2 inches of cedar planking over heavy oak framing, you are building a hull that is designed to take a severe beating from the ocean. The records show she had a beam of 17 feet, meaning she was 17 feet wide at her thickest point, and a draft of over 7 feet.
Okay, let's pause on that. A draft of 7 feet. That means 7 feet of the ship's hull is just sitting entirely below the waterline, right?
Correct. A deep draft like that on a 69-foot vessel means she had a very low center of gravity.
So she wouldn't tip over easily.
Right. She was incredibly stable, built to handle open ocean swells without capsizing. And that specific rugged construction is exactly what caught the eye of the United States Navy in October 1941.
Right before the U.S. entered World War II.
Exactly. They acquired the Joyita, sailed her out to Hawaii, and outfitted her as a yard patrol boat. She was designated YP-108, and she spent the war patrolling the waters around the Big Island.
And this is where the narrative shifts, doesn't it? We go from a Hollywood history lesson to the quiet, creeping start of a horror story.
Yeah, the fatal flaw is introduced here.
Because in 1943, while out on patrol, the Joyita runs aground. She sustains heavy damage. Now, in a normal situation, if you break a pipe deep in a ship's engine cooling system, you replace it with copper or brass.
Right, because those metals can handle the constant flow of corrosive seawater.
But it's 1943. We are deep into a world war. There are massive material shortages across the board.
The Navy was desperate. They needed to keep every available hull in the water. So instead of waiting for copper or brass, the maintenance crews took a shortcut.
A really bad shortcut.
They replaced the broken pipes in the Joyita's raw water cooling circuit with galvanized iron.
Okay, I have to stop you there. A raw water cooling circuit, what exactly does that do?
Well, a marine diesel engine generates intense heat.
Right.
To keep it from literally melting down, ships pump cold ocean water, which they call raw water, directly from the sea. They run it through a network of pipes around the engine to cool it down, and then pump that heated seawater back out into the ocean.
So these pipes are just constantly filled with flowing salt water.
247 whenever the engine is running.
And they patched it with galvanized iron. I mean, it seems completely absurd to me. You have this heavy-duty cedar and oak fortress of a hull, and you patch its internal circulatory system with cheap scrap metal.
It was a wartime expediency.
But how does a literal ticking time bomb of incompatible metals just sit deep inside the hull for 12 years completely undetected?
To understand that, we have to look at the slow, invisible physics of galvanic corrosion.
Ah.
It's a chemical reaction. It happens when you connect two dissimilar metals and submerge them in an electrolyte. And seawater is a highly, highly conductive electrolyte.
So if I'm picturing this, it's like an unintended science experiment happening down in the bilge.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it like a car battery. If you take a piece of silver and a piece of aluminum, touch them together, and drop them in a bucket of salt water, you've just built a very weak battery.
Right.
The salt water allows electrons to flow from the less noble metal, which is the aluminum, to the more noble metal, the silver. The aluminum literally sacrifices its own electrons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So in the Joyita, you had cheap galvanized iron pipes bolted directly to heavy bronze and copper engine fittings. Over the course of 12 years, the salt water facilitated this microscopic, relentless electrical current. The bronze slowly pulled electrons from the iron.
Meaning the iron was literally dissolving, just turning into a brittle sponge, atom by atom, while the ship was just going about its business on the surface.
Precisely. It's a silent decay. From the outside, the pipe might even look perfectly intact, maybe just a little rusty.
Right, you wouldn't even know.
But structurally, it had the integrity of a wet graham cracker. It was just waiting for the right vibration or a surge in pressure to completely fail.
God, it's chilling to think about. This ship is just sitting there, slowly rotting from the inside out. But the story gets even stranger, because after the war, the Navy strips her and sells her off.
Right.
And in 1948, a firm called Louis Brothers buys her, and they make a massive structural modification. They want to use her for the refrigerated transport of frozen goods. So to insulate these new refrigerated holds, they line the entire hull of the ship with 640 cubic feet of cork.
And that single modification, that is what fundamentally changes the physics of the Joyita. 640 cubic feet of cork is a massive, massive volume.
To put that into perspective for you, the listener, imagine taking the entire interior volume of 2 large yellow school buses and stuffing them completely full of wine corks. That is the amount of buoyancy we were talking about, packed tightly between the ribs of this heavy wooden ship.
It's incredible. That cork transformed the Joyita into a gigantic 69-foot floating life preserver. I mean, even if every single compartment flooded all the way to the ceiling with water, the displacement of that cork meant the ship fundamentally could not sink beneath the waves.
Which brings us to the captain. In 1952, a university professor buys the boat. He charters it to a British-born sailor living in Samoa named Captain Thomas H. Miller. Everyone locally called him Dusty Miller.
Dusty Miller, right.
And he uses this aging, cork-lined, secretly rusting luxury yacht as a trading and fishing charter.
And the stage is perfectly set for a tragedy. You have a tough, highly buoyant vessel hiding a fatal flaw deep in its engine room. But a flawed ship alone doesn't cause a disaster. You need the human element. You need a captain willing to push that ship beyond its limits.
So let's get into that human element. We're moving to the timeline of the final voyage now. It's October 3rd, 1955. The Joyita is in Apia Harbor in Samoa. She's preparing for a 270-mile run to the Tokelau Islands. That's open Pacific Ocean. It's expected to take about 2 days. And let's look at the manifest, because this isn't just about cargo. There are 25 souls on board. 16 crew, and 9 passengers.
And the passenger list is deeply varied. You have a government official, you have local workers, a copra buyer.
Wait, a copra buyer? What exactly is copra?
Oh, copra is the dried meat of a coconut. It was a massive cash crop in the Pacific at the time, used to extract coconut oil. So you have these agricultural merchants on board.
Okay, that makes sense.
But far more tragically, the passenger list included 2 children, a 3-year-old girl and an 11-year-old boy. And crucially, Dr. Alfred Parsons. They called him Andy.
Dr. Parsons was a World War II surgeon based in Appia, right?
Yes, he was. And his presence is a vital piece of the timeline because he wasn't on a pleasure cruise. He was traveling to Tokelau on a very urgent medical mission. Someone on the islands required an immediate amputation, and he was the surgeon traveling to perform it.
Wow.
So that medical emergency placed a heavy ticking clock over the entire departure.
And they needed that urgency because the departure itself was a total mess. The Joyita was supposed to leave the day before, on October 2nd, but she didn't.
Well,
The clutch on her port main engine completely failed while they were still in port.
and faced with a 270-mile open ocean crossing, losing one of your two primary engines is a glaring red flag.
It's insane.
Any textbook maritime procedure dictates you do not leave port until propulsion is restored. You just don't. But Captain Miller made the call to depart anyway. Early on the morning of October 3rd, the Joyita chucked out of the harbor on only one working engine.
This is where I struggle to comprehend the mindset. Port authorities just let a ship with 25 people leave with half its propulsion dead. On top of that, the source material notes Miller's license to carry fare-paying passengers had actually lapsed.
Yeah, he wasn't even legally allowed to have them on board.
He's breaking maritime law. He's risking his crew, a surgeon, and 2 young children on a crippled vessel. Why roll the dice like that?
It comes down to desperation and hubris. Captain Dusty Miller was in a severe financial hole. He had recently run a series of deep-sea fishing charters on the Joyita that had failed miserably. He was practically drowning in debt.
So he needed the money.
Badly. This specific government charter to Tokelau was his lifeline. If he delayed to fix the engine, assuming he even had the funds to repair it in the first place, he risked losing the lucrative government contracts he had lined up to keep his business afloat. He quite literally couldn't afford to stay in port.
So the financial desperation just blinded him to the physical danger, but surely he knew the risks of the open ocean.
He did, but Miller had a psychological safety net. He was intimately familiar with his ship's modifications. He knew about the 640 cubic feet of cork in the hull.
Right, the floating life preserver.
Exactly. He also knew they were carrying a specific piece of cargo on this trip. 80 empty 45-gallon oil drums.
More trapped air,
Yeah.
more displacement.
Yes. In Miller's mind, the Joyita was physically incapable of sinking. That overconfidence was his tragic flaw. He believed that no matter what happened out there, engine failure, storms, even flooding the ship itself would always keep them on the surface. He felt he could sail a broken ship into the dark because the ship was his ultimate lifeboat.
God. So at 5 a.m. in the pre-dawn darkness, they slip out of Apia Harbor, limping along on one engine. They are scheduled to arrive in Tokelau on October 5th. The 5th arrives, nothing. On October 6th, the port of Fak-Ofo sends a message. The Joyita is officially overdue.
And this is where the isolation of the Pacific really comes into play. There's no land-based radio operator, no passing merchant ship. Nobody reported hearing a single distress call. The Joyita had simply evaporated.
Jerk on.
A massive search and rescue operation was launched immediately. The Royal New Zealand Air Force deployed Sunderland flying boats. These are massive, long-range, amphibious aircraft. They flew grid patterns over the ocean.
And the scale of that search is just staggering. They covered an estimated 100,000 square miles of open ocean. For a week, they flew over rolling blue waves, looking for debris, oil slicks, life rafts, anything.
And they found absolutely nothing.
Because the Pacific Ocean is unfathomably vast. Finding a 69-foot wooden boat adrift out there, it's literally worse than finding a needle in a haystack. It's finding a needle in a haystack where the hay is constantly moving.
Yeah, the currents are always shifting.
So for 5 weeks, the families of those 25 people were left in agonizing silence. Until November 10th, we are back on the bridge of the merchant ship Tuvalu, captained by Gerald Douglas. He's on a completely different route, sailing from Suva to Funafuti.
Right.
And there, wallowing in the heavy swells over 600 miles west of her scheduled route, is the Joyita.
Boarding that vessel must have been a profoundly chilling experience.
I can't even imagine.
The recovery party stepped onto a ship that had essentially become a floating tomb. And the clues they found scattered across the deck and in the flooded cabins, I mean, they read like a forensic masterclass in terror.
Yeah.
Every single piece of evidence pointed to a frantic, doomed struggle in the dead of night.
Let's treat this like an active crime scene. Let's look at the physical evidence because it paints a very specific, very terrifying picture. First, the electrical systems. The electric clock in the wheelhouse was frozen at exactly 10.25.
Yeah.
The cabin lights and the navigation lights on the masts were switched to the AN position.
which immediately establishes the timeline of the catastrophe.
Huh.
Disaster struck at night, while it was pitch black outside, and total electrical failure occurred precisely at 10:25 p.m.
Right. Then there's the radio. It was found tuned to 2182 kilohertz. That is the International Marine Radio Telephone Distress Channel. Somebody on that ship was desperately trying to call for help.
Yes.
But the investigators found a horrifying detail. There was a break in the cable between the radio set and the aerial.
And that break wasn't obvious. It had been painted over, likely during routine maintenance. And because of that hidden break, the radio's effective range was totally crippled. It was reduced to a radius of about 2 miles.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around that. Paint is just a liquid coating. How does a layer of paint kill a radio signal to the point that nobody can hear a distress call?
It's all about grounding in the transmission of radio frequency energy. For a radio to broadcast over long distances, the signal has to travel from the transmitter up the internal wiring and out into the main aerial antenna to be broadcast into the atmosphere.
Okay.
The wire on the Joyita had a physical break in the conductive metal. Whoever painted over it inadvertently created a dielectric barrier, an insulator. The paint held the physical ends of the broken wire somewhat close together, but the electrical conductivity was completely severed. So when the operator keyed the microphone and sent the Mayday signal, the radio frequency energy traveled up the wire, hit that painted break, and instead of radiating out into the world, the energy reflected back down into the transmitter. It essentially short-circuited the broadcast capability.
That is deeply haunting. You can imagine someone in the dark clutching that microphone, screaming into the handset, watching the gauges light up, thinking the message is getting out.
Thinking help is coming.
Exactly. But in reality, their voice is barely making it past the ship's own mast. They were screaming into the void, and the void couldn't even hear them.
It's horrible.
Now, what did the investigators find down below in the engine room?
Well, the engine room was a scene of absolute chaos. The starboard engine, which was the one that had been working when it left port, was found covered by mattresses. The port engine, the one with the broken clutch, was partially disassembled.
So they were working on it.
Tools were scattered everywhere. They were clearly trying to conduct mid-ocean repairs.
They also found an auxiliary pump. Someone had dragged it into the engine room, mounted it on a wooden plank, and slung it between the two main engines. But it hadn't even been connected to the water lines.
Right.
And the ship's actual built-in bilge pumps, they were completely clogged with debris.
And that is a crucial failure point. A bilge pump is designed to suck water out of the bottom of the ship and discharge it overboard. But a ship's bilge is filthy. It's full of oil, dirt, loose rags, and debris.
Naturally.
You have to install a strainer, like a metal cage, over the intake hose to stop trash from getting sucked into the pump mechanism. The Joyita's bilge pumps did not have strainers fitted.
So the moment water started flooding the ship, they turned on the pumps, and the pumps immediately inhaled a bunch of garbage and jammed,
Instantly useless.
leaving them to try and hastily rig up a backup pump on a wooden plank while the water is literally rising around their ankles.
Exactly. It shows a desperate race against time. And then investigators cataloged what was missing from the ship. 3 Carly life rafts. These are large, oval-shaped, buoyant rings with webbing in the center, designed to support multiple people in the water.
Gone.
The ship's small, wooden dinghy, gone.
The logbook, the sextant, the mechanical chronometer, all vital navigational tools were gone. Captain Miller was known to keep several firearms on board. Those were missing. 4 tons of cargo were unaccounted for.
Yeah.
And then the centerpiece of the nightmare. Abandoned on the deck, exposed to the elements, was the doctor's bag. Inside were the scalpel, the stethoscope, and 4 lengths of bandage stained with fresh blood.
When you synthesize all these forensic clues, you can really reconstruct the minute-by-minute terror the Joyita's final hours. Let's place ourselves on the ship.
Okay.
It's the second night of the voyage. You are perhaps 30 hours out of Samoa.
You're surrounded by the deep ocean. The weather reports from that night indicated the swells were getting heavy, driven by squalls with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. It's loud. The wooden hull is groaning. It's likely after 9:00 p.m.
And deep down in the belly of the ship, in the raw water circuit of the port engine, that 12-year-old galvanized iron pipe finally gives way.
The ticking time bomb goes off.
The galvanic corrosion has eaten it to the breaking point, and the pressure of the ocean outside simply pushes right through.
And what's terrifying is how silent that initial breach would be. I mean, there's no cinematic explosion, there's no alarm bell, there's just this sudden high-pressure rush of freezing ocean water pouring into the bilges in the dark.
Yeah.
The crew wouldn't have known anything was wrong until the water level literally rose above the floorboards of the engine room.
Imagine the sheer shock of that. You were a mechanic in that cramped, hot, incredibly noisy engine space. Suddenly, icy water is sloshing over your boots.
Panic sets in immediately.
The water is rising fast. They dive for the bilge pumps, turn them on, and within seconds, the pumps suck up debris and violently jam. The water just keeps rising.
They frantically drag the auxiliary pump down the stairs. They sling the wooden plank between the engines. They're fumbling with hoses and wrenches, trying to get this backup pump connected. But the tide is rising too fast inside their own ship.
They can't keep up.
And the starboard engine is still running, spinning thousands of revolutions per minute. As the water level hits the bottom of that engine's spinning flywheel, it starts violently kicking up a massive spray of salt water across the room.
And that saltwater spray is hitting the ship's main electrical switchboard. Someone realizes they're about to lose all power.
Yeah, it's the mattresses.
Right. They grab mattresses from the crew bunks, drag them down into the engine room, and throw them over the starboard engine, desperately trying to shield the electronics from the geyser of salt water.
But you can't hold back the ocean. The water drowns the starboard engine. The engine stutters and dies. The generator shorts out.
Total failure.
The electric clock on the wall of the wheelhouse clicks to a halt at 10:25 p.m. The lights instantly die, and the entire ship plunges into absolute suffocating darkness.
And without the engine, the Joyita loses all forward momentum. When a ship loses speed, it loses the ability to steer. It becomes entirely at the mercy of the ocean's physical forces.
Right.
In 40-mile-per-hour winds, the vessel naturally turns sideways to the waves, what we call falling beam onto the swell.
Which means instead of the bow slicing through the waves are broadsiding the ship, slamming violently into the side of the hull.
Exactly. And now you have thousands of gallons of heavy water trapped in the lower decks. As the waves hit the side of the ship, that trapped water violently sloshes to the port side, throwing the ship's center of gravity completely off.
Oh, that sounds sickening.
The ship takes on a terrifying list. The port rail is pushed downward, perilously close to the turbulent surfing on the ocean.
Put yourself in the shoes of a passenger right then. Maybe you are that 11-year-old boy. You are trapped in a cabin. It is pitch black. The floor suddenly tilts at a 45-degree angle and just stays there.
You can't even stand up.
You can hear freezing water rushing through the hallways below you. The wind is screaming outside. The ship is violently bucking, and every time a wave hits, it feels like the whole vessel is going to capsize and roll over, trapping you underwater.
It is a profound disruption of the human vestibular system. Your sense of balance in space is entirely compromised by the darkness and the violent motion. The physiological terror would be unimaginable.
Oh, terrible, really.
And somewhere in this blinding chaos, a severe injury occurs. Perhaps someone is violently thrown against a bulkhead as the ship lurches. The doctor, working entirely by feel in the howling wind, opens his bag on the slanted deck.
Because he can't see anything.
No, he's frantically trying to wrap bandages over a bleeding wound while the ship feels like it's literally dying beneath him.
And this leads us to the ultimate mind-bending paradox of the Joyita tragedy. The ship is dark, it is flooded, it is leaning at a terrifying angle, but it didn't sink.
No, it didn't. In February 1956, a formal maritime inquiry was convened in Apia to investigate the disaster.
Right.
They systematically mapped out the mechanics of the flooding, the corroded pipe, the lack of pump strainers.
Yeah.
And they placed heavy, justified blame on Captain Miller for his reckless decision to sail a poorly maintained ship on one engine.
Sure.
But when the inquiry reached the question of what happened to the 25 passengers and crew, their official legal ruling was simply inexplicable.
Because despite the catastrophic flooding, the hull itself was entirely sound. Between the 640 cubic feet of cork lining the holds and the cargo of 80 empty oil drums acting as massive air bladders, the Joyita was fundamentally unsinkable.
The inquiry proved it.
Right. When the recovery teams eventually towed the battered ship all the way to Suva and pumped the water out of the lower decks, she righted herself and floated perfectly on a stable, even keel.
Which means the safest place to be in that entire stretch of the Pacific Ocean, even with water sloshing over the floorboards, was on that ship.
It's crazy.
The inquiry noted that abandoning a vessel equipped with that level of inherent buoyancy made absolutely no logical sense.
I just don't get it.
Yeah.
Miller knew the boat was unsinkable. He banked his life on it. He bragged about it. Why on earth would anyone, especially Miller, but even the first mate, if Miller was the one injured, look at a pitch-black, storm-tossing ocean, look at these flimsy little open-air Carly rafts and say, we are safer out there in the freezing water than we are on this heavy wooden deck.
This is where we must bridge the gap between maritime engineering and human psychology.
Okay.
In a disaster, we assume logic will prevail because we are analyzing it from the safety of dry land. But out there, in the dark, you are dealing with the phenomenon of the abandonment cascade.
The abandonment cascade, what does that look like in real time?
Well, we have to assume Captain Miller was incapacitated. The bloody bandages strongly suggest a severe trauma. If the captain, the one man whose supreme authority and absolute knowledge of the cork lining could have maintained order, is severely injured, unconscious, or dead, the psychological anchor of the ship is instantly removed.
Leaving a vacuum of leadership.
Exactly. You are left with a first mate, a crew, and terrified passengers who do not understand the physics of the vessel.
So they see the water rising, they feel a ship leaning so far over they can barely stand, and the illusion of control just shatters.
Precisely. When the structural environment around a human being begins to fail, especially a ship leaning precipitously into the dark water, logic is overwritten by the primal survival instinct. The instinct to flee a collapsing structure is hardwired into our biology.
It's panic.
It's a form of negative panic. The terrifying vulnerability of the ocean takes over. If someone screams that the ship is going down and they start unlashing the life rafts and throwing them overboard, mob mentality takes hold instantaneously. In their minds, staying on the slanted deck felt like waiting to be dragged to the bottom of the sea. They chose the immediate illusion of action, which was getting into the rafts, over the terrifying, counterintuitive reality of staying on a flooded ship.
But getting into those rafts was a death sentence. The elements, the wind, dehydration, the sheer scale of the ocean, it was a watery grave. Yet, there are elements of this forensic puzzle that suggest this wasn't just a panicked, chaotic scramble into the dark.
Right.
We have missing firearms, missing navigational tools, and 4 tons of cargo vanished. That points to a sequence of events far more deliberate and perhaps far more violent.
Which leads us out of the realm of physical evidence and into the realm of the theories that just exploded in the press. Decades. The Joyita became a blank canvas for every anxiety of the 1950s.
It really did.
We need to analyze these theories critically. The most prominent, heavily researched theory was put forward by British author Robin Maugham.
Maugham was obsessed with this case. He actually bought the rotting hull of the Joyita years later, spent years investigating the structural layout, and published a book in 1962 called The Joyita Mystery. His theory centers entirely on a violent mutiny.
Yes. Maugham based his theory on testimonies regarding the crew dynamics. He, along with Captain S.B. Brown, who was a close personal friend of Captain Miller, noted that there was intense, documented friction between Miller and his American first mate, Chuck Simpson.
They didn't get along.
They despise each other. Maugham's hypothesis is that as the flooding accelerated and the weather deteriorated into howling squalls, a massive confrontation took place on the slanted deck.
The psychology of it tracks perfectly. I mean, Miller is financially desperate. He needs this charter to clear his debts. He knows the ship is packed with cork and absolutely won't sink, so he belligerently refuses to call for help or abandon ship.
Right.
But Simpson, and maybe the rest of the terrified crew, see the water rising, the engine dead, the ship leaning into the waves. They demand he evacuate the passengers.
Maugham suggests this argument escalated into a violent physical brawl in the dark. During this struggle, someone, most likely Captain Miller, sustains a severe, blunt force or penetrating injury.
Which perfectly accounts for the doctor's bag left open on the deck and the freshly blood-stained bandages.
Exactly. With Miller incapacitated or killed in the struggle, the chain of command violently shifts to Chuck Simpson.
But Simpson doesn't know the ship is fundamentally unsinkable. He just sees a flooded, dead ship that looks like it's seconds away from rolling over. So Simpson, now in command, makes the fatal miscalculation. He orders the evacuation.
Yes.
He takes the firearms. Perhaps he used them in the mutiny. He meticulously gathers the logbook, the sextant, and the navigational tools. They load the bleeding Miller onto the rafts, and they abandon the vessel.
It is a highly plausible narrative because it neatly accounts for almost every piece of missing physical evidence. Malm further theorized that with the navigational tools, Simpson may have calculated a course toward a nearby island or reef, believing they could row to safety.
But they couldn't.
No. The 40-mile-per-hour squall winds simply blew their fragile rafts out into the deep, trackless expanse of the ocean, where they eventually succumbed to the elements.
It's a haunting scenario. A violent mutiny born of terror, leading directly to a fatal collective suicide by miscalculation. But while Maughem's theory grounds itself in psychology, the 1950s public wasn't satisfied.
No, they wanted something bigger.
This was the Cold War era. World War II was only 10 years in the rearview mirror. The disappearance of 25 people sparked intense geopolitical paranoia.
We have to view the subsequent theories through the lens of 1955. The Pacific was still scarred by the war. The Fiji Times and Herald published an explosive article quoting an impeccable source, claiming that the Joyita had inadvertently passed through a heavily guarded fleet of Japanese fishing boats and had observed something the Japanese did not want them to see.
The London Daily Telegraph took it even further. They hypothesized that active, rogue Japanese military forces, holdouts from WWII operating from some isolated, unmapped island base, had intercepted the ship, slaughtered the crew, and stolen the cargo.
It sounds like a movie plot.
It does. There was a tremendous amount of lingering anti-Japanese sentiment in the Pacific, particularly in Fiji, over Japanese fleets operating aggressively in local fishing waters.
And this theory seemed to gain incredible traction when the salvage teams, clearing the abandoned hull of the Joyita, found several knives on board that were stamped with the words, "Made in Japan." To the paranoid public, this was the definitive smoking gun.
But when you actually apply rigorous investigation to that so-called smoking gun, it falls apart completely, doesn't it?
It disintegrates. Forensic tests on the Japanese knives proved entirely negative. There was no trace of blood, no sign they had been used in a struggle. Investigators determined they were simply old, broken fishing knives left on board from when Captain Miller used the Joyita for deep-sea fishing charters years prior.
Wow.
It was a complete red herring, amplified by the anxieties of the era.
And the paranoia didn't stop at rogue WWII holdouts. There were serious propositions in the press that a Soviet submarine had surfaced, kidnapped the occupants for interrogation, and vanished. There were wild rumors of modern-day sea pirates boarding the ship, executing everyone, and stealing the 4 tons of missing cargo.
The colonial government in Fiji had to issue strong official denials to quell the panic. They pointed out the stark lack of physical evidence for an external attack. The hull had no bullet holes.
The heavy wooden doors weren't splintered.
Right. The cabins weren't ransacked. If pirates or a military force boarded that ship, there would be signs of a coordinated struggle, not just an abandoned doctor's bag and a missing logbook.
The last major theory to touch on is insurance fraud. Because Miller was drowning in debt, armchair detectives speculated that he intentionally scuttled the ship, murdered the passengers, and escaped to start a new life with the payout.
Which is the easiest theory to debunk mechanically. First, as we established at length, you physically cannot scuttle a ship packed with 640 cubic feet of cork. It will not sink, no matter how many holes you punch in it.
Right, impossible.
Second, investigators checked the sea cocks, which are the heavy valves in the hull used to intentionally let water in or out, and they were all found tightly closed.
So no intentional flooding.
Exactly. Third, Miller didn't need insurance money. He had lucrative government charters lined up. If he just completed his runs, he would have legally earned his way out of debt.
So the external attack theories, the Cold War submarine theories, the fraud theories, they all evaporate under scrutiny. We are left staring at the cold, hard reality. A corroded iron pipe, a flooded engine room, a broken radio wire, and a desperate, terrifying human decision to abandon ship.
Yeah.
The exact catalyst, whether it was pure negative panic or a violent mutiny led by the first mate, is a mystery forever swallowed by the Pacific. But here's where the story takes a turn from a tragedy into something that feels almost supernaturally cursed.
Absolutely.
Because the Joyita herself did not end her life in 1955. She was towed back to port, and she carried the weight of her missing souls like a permanent infection.
The grim afterlife of the MV Joyita is almost as inexplicable as her disappearance. In July 1956, she was put up for auction by her original owners. She was purchased for £2,425 by a Fiji Islander named David Simpson. And for the record, he had absolutely no relation to the missing first mate, Chuck Simpson.
Good to clarify.
David Simpson refitted her, overhauled the engines, and miraculously sent her back to sea as a trading vessel that very same year.
You really have to pause and imagine the psychology of buying that ship. knowing that 25 people vanished into the dark from those exact decks, knowing the bloodstains were on that wood.
It's eerie.
But immediately the ship gets bogged down in complex legal disputes over transferring her registry from the United States to Britain. And then the curse strikes again. In January 1957, carrying 13 passengers, she runs aground on a reef in the Coral Sea.
She was pulled off the reef, repaired yet again, and in 1958 she began a regular trade route between Levuka and Suva. But the Joyita simply could not escape her own tragic momentum.
Nope.
In November 1959, she ran aground on a reef again at Vatuvalu near Levuka.
And this specific grounding is where you just have to shake your head at the sheer absurdity of human error. The ship floats off the reef at high tide, but she's taken structural damage. A seam splits in the heavy wooden hull. She starts taking on seawater.
Right.
The crew realizes they are sinking, so they fire up the newly repaired bilge pumps to save her. But the pumps don't clear the water. Why? Because the mechanics who overhauled the ship had installed the pump valves completely backward.
I still can't believe that.
The crew was literally using the pumps to suck ocean water into the already sinking hull.
It is an astonishing culmination of errors. It defies belief.
It's as if the ship was a magnet for incompetence. She survives the greatest, most terrifying maritime mystery of the South Pacific. She survives 100,000 square miles of isolation, only to be killed by a backwards pump valve.
At that point, her fate was irrevocably sealed. She had earned a deeply entrenched, superstitious reputation across the Pacific as an unlucky ship. No crew wanted to sail her.
I don't blame him.
With a damaged hull and a dark history, she was finally abandoned by her owners and beached. She was stripped of any useful mechanical equipment and left as a rotting wooden hulk on the sand. As we mentioned, Robin Mom bought her, researched his book, and then sold the hulk in 1966 to a Major J. Castling Caudill.
Right.
The Major had this bizarre, almost morbid plan to turn the cursed ship into a museum and a tourist tear room.
A tear room on the deck of the Joyita.
The plan, thankfully, fell through. The hulk simply sat on the beach at Levuka, disappearing piece by piece. She was scavenged by locals for wood, rotting away in the salt air until the physical disintegration was entirely complete by the late 1970s.
Gone forever.
But while the physical wood and iron are gone, the memory of the Joyita has been rigidly preserved. In 1975, the Western Samoa Post Office released a set of stamps dealing with the mystery. In 2009, a public walkway was named after the surgeon, Dr. Parsons, in New Zealand. And in 2012, memory stones were finally erected in Samoa and Tokelau to honor the 25 lost souls.
And yet, it's a haunting footnote that as of 2012, all 25 people aboard were still legally declared as missing. Formal calls had to be made for declarations of death, just to give the remaining families some semblance of legal closure. The physical ship has returned to the Earth, but the psychological horror of what happened on that night in 1955 remains permanently anchored in maritime history.
It does. It is a defining case study in maritime disaster.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, let's synthesize exactly what we've uncovered. We didn't find a paranormal event. We found a tragic, fatal convergence of physical and psychological failures.
Right.
The Joyita disaster was born of hubris. It was a captain desperate to clear his debts, willing to sail on a broken engine. It was 12-year-old rusted, galvanized pipework, silently corroding in the dark. It was a radio wire carelessly painted over, blinding the ship's ability to scream for help.
It's just tragedy after tragedy.
And it was the pitch-black, freezing, howling isolation of the Pacific Ocean. 25 lives were erased not by a sea monster, not by a Soviet submarine, but by the terrifying realities of the sea. The mechanical inevitability of a flooded engine and the extreme fragility of the human mind when placed under unbearable pressure.
It is a profoundly sobering reality. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the profound tragedy of the Joyita. I want you to put yourself back on that flooded, slanted deck one last time.
Just really picture it.
The wind is screaming in your ears. The ship is completely dark. Below you, illuminated only by the white caps of the waves, is the unfathomable, freezing depth of the oceanic abyss. We are taught, evolutionarily, that our survival instincts are our greatest asset.
Right, fight or flight.
They are the primal alarms that keep us alive when our higher logic fails. We rely on that urge to fight or flee to save us in our darkest moments. But the Joyita asks a much darker, much more terrifying psychological question.
What's that?
What happens when our own survival instinct, that desperate, blinding biological urge to flee a sinking floor, is the exact thing that tricks us into stepping off the edge of safety, directly into the abyss?
You're standing on the safe, solid deck of the Tuvalu, The recovery spotlights are cutting through the endless dark. The Joyita is bobbing silently in the water, a ghost ship made of cork and wood. You look into the smashed wheelhouse, and the clock is frozen forever at 10:25. The ocean is unimaginably vast, and it keeps its secrets. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.